Turn up the dive, feel the vibe, get ready to ignite. Untold stories in the airways, flying through the night. Experience voices, tales so bold. Streaming live, the truth unfolds. Untold Radio Network, where secrets come alive. New episodes daily, the mysteries thrive. Great guests, super chat, so I remember I share and subscribe. Join the side where truth can't hide. Aliens in the attic, UFOs in the sky. Cryptids lurking, oh my, oh my. Ghosts in the hallway, whispering your name. The paranormal, the unexplained. Become a VIP, get the inside scoop. Unlock the mysteries, be part of the group. Live streaming stories are talking to you. Super chats buzzing, join the group. Untold Radio Network, where secrets come alive. New episodes daily, the mysteries thrive. Great guests, super chat, it's a wild member ride. Share and subscribe, join the side where truth can hide. So if you've got the guts and you want to explore, tune into the Untold, it's what you're looking for. From aliens to ghosts and all that's unseen. Untold Radio Network, where the world's mysteries convene.
The paranormal, UFOs, monsters, mysteries. You're listening to Talking Weird. And now, from a cabin deep in the Northwoods, your host, Dr. Dean Bertram.
Greetings, all my fellow weirdos and weirdads. Welcome to Talking Weird on the Untold Radio Network. I'm delighted all of you could join me tonight up here in the North Woods. It's very pleasant. It feels like summer here. I was cooking outside. I was playing outside with my daughter today. Still busy with the Shaver Mystery short, which I'm constantly talking about, part of my feature documentary, The Man Who Invented Flying Saucers, which maybe myself and my guest will get around to talking about a little bit tonight, because he is going to be in the film. We had some wonderful news on the weekend. It just screened at Sydney Underground Film Festival, as well as the Northwest Flying Saucer Film Festival, where it won. I couldn't be there, unfortunately, but it won Best Documentary, which was very humbling. For those of you around the country who still haven't screened it, it's still screening in all kinds of places. This coming weekend, it's screening at Arizona Underground Film Festival. That kicks off in Tucson, Arizona this Friday night. And the Shaver Mystery will be screening in a short block, which takes place on Sunday, September 22 at 2 p.m. It's also screening at the Underground Documentary Film Festival the following weekend in Bremerton, Washington. And that will be on Saturday, September 28. I'm not sure of the exact time of it yet, but I will let people know when that's going to take place. I'd love people who could get out there to see the film. It would be fantastic. I know a number of listeners have been to screenings at festivals so far, and I always love to hear back from people that they enjoyed the film. I'm really delighted to be talking to our guest tonight, because we share a great interest in flying saucers and perhaps some of the significance behind the manifestation of these things in our skies. He's a graphic designer who's had a lifelong fascination with the weird and anomalous. He brings his years of experience in brand identity to his ongoing study of how symbols and archetypes change moments in cultural history. For the past few years, he's focused on reverse engineering the flying saucer archetype. In a process, he discovered what he calls the technological imaginal, which I just can't wait to talk to him about, a space where utopian, fantasy, speculation, and intervention flow into one another, where science fiction and scientific progress exist in a symbiotic relationship. He suggests that an American Tech Imaginal flourished from the end of the 19th century into the 20th century post-war period, where it collapsed in the wake of the development of the atomic bomb. His blog at Liminosity.space is currently under development and will launch sometime before Halloween this year, which I can't wait to do a start to read. So I'm absolutely delighted to welcome to Talking Weird, Marco Acevedo. Marco, greetings.
Hey, greetings. Hi, Dean.
So good to have you here, man.
It's great to be here. And, I see that you've had some really amazing guests. And so I'm very, very honored that you have me on here. So thank you.
Well, your work sounds just completely fascinating. And maybe before we get into that, because I really want to, pick your brain about it, maybe you could let the listeners who aren't that aware of you, at least let them know how you got interested in this type of stuff in the first place.
Well, I mean, this sort of dovetails into sort of how I approach this whole subject, but I was born in 61, so I'm a sort of a late boomer. And ever since I could see, Outer Limits on television and Lost in Space and that kind of thing, I've been interested in the weird and in science fiction in particular. And flying saucers I became aware of pretty early on, like I think a lot of kids back then. And I followed that up with reading whatever I could about it. I, read probably some classic paperbacks on the whole flying saucer thing in the 1970s. And even after becoming a graphic designer, it's just always been sitting in the back there, my interest in this kind of thing. Not just flying saucers, but that's sort of like the crux of my interest in what I call, the paranormal or the anomalous.
It all seems to intersect so much, and perhaps if not tonight, another night, I'm sure you and I will talk about these intersections of the broader, realm of Fortean phenomenon.
Sure.
But when I heard your theory about the technological imaginal, the first thing I guess I wondered, in fact, no, I'll get to that in a minute. Let's maybe start off with your concept of the technological imaginal, because the term brings all kinds of ideas to my mind, but maybe that's something else you can lay a groundwork for. And it might take you a little while to do, because I have the feeling it's a fairly, heady kind of fascinating topic.
Yeah, actually, I'm sort of glad you read its description back to me that I wrote for you, because it's a little bit hard to describe, and it's because it encompasses so much. But basically, I would say I kind of came across this idea as I was delving into the zeitgeist of the era that the flying saucer in particular appeared. Because 2017 happened, and all of a sudden on the front page of the New York Times we have stories about official, or at that point semi-official, videos from the Pentagon showing what were now going to be called UAPs. And so it was amazing that all of a sudden everybody's talking about UFOs, but they're not calling them UFOs. They're calling them UAPs, and the whole language is different. The narrative seems to be pretty much in the control of the Pentagon and whoever's talking about it in Congress and all of all the characters involved in that whole thing. And all of a sudden, the narrative is back to cover up and disclosure and that kind of thing. And I don't know, there's something about the fact that all of a sudden, all you saw were images, these sort of blurry images of these little dots, and they were described as tic tacs or gimbals, or but it was always something really tiny, always in the crosshairs of a sort of a military interface. And it seems like a far cry from the state of the visual language, at least around UFOs, when this all started. And I mean, there's a lot of reasons for that, but I think one thing is that in the 1950s, we were coming towards the end of a period that, at least in the U.S., I would say started at the end of the 1800s, going into the beginning of the 20th century, where scientific discoveries and inventions, particularly inventions, because those were kind of our folk heroes at that time, folks like Thomas Edison, Samuel F.B. Morse. There was this sense of this sort of acceleration of progress and amazing technology. And I think I would say starting in the 1920s, the everyman kind of just got involved because the radio era started. And so now not only is technology making great leaps and bounds, all of a sudden it is a consumer item that everyone is buying and everyone is getting into, and it sort of changed popular culture right there. And from that point on, I think that consumers, people who bought radios or bought magazines about radios, Hugo Gernsback, who basically created the modern concept of science fiction with his in his pulp Amazing Stories. And so I think another pulp before that, I forget its name. He also published, his big thing was radio pulps or magazines on the whole, the amateur interest in radios. So I think that there was, especially from the 20s, the sense of, the future is rushing towards us. But it was never just a matter of, genius scientists creating all of this stuff. There was a sort of a democratic aspect to it. I think there was this a sense, a sort of fantasy that was also established in these magazines. If you look at the ads in Hugo Gernsback's magazines, and even into the 40s, once Ray Palmer was running Amazing Stories, all the ads were, correspondence courses in becoming a technician, becoming, in radio, and, probably television at a certain point. Technology and science were kind of in a different place back then. And it sort of formed this, a continuum with just plain old imagination, with mythology, with fairy tales. This kind of a flux of, even just looking at the publications, right? Technology, radios, science fiction, and everything kind of rushing towards, I'd say the sort of climax of that was the 1939 World's Fair, which was really crucial in showing people that there still was a future, that there still was this sort of like utopia just around the corner, even in the wake of, the Depression, the sense that, a war was just around the corner. There was still this like amazing sense of optimism. That was all wrapped up, of course, with commercialism and companies hawking their products, but everyone felt like everything was going to be great. The Flash Gordon future was going to be upon us. But the reality was that this openness in science and technology, which was a thing ever since the Enlightenment, when scientists realized that if they shared data, they could piggyback on each other's successes, and progress would come along that much faster. So science had always been very open and democratic. And again, that sort of swept into what I termed the technological. I'm losing my words here.
The technological imaginal.
The tech imaginal, yes. But there came a point when, and people weren't really aware of it, when cutting edge science was no longer public, was no longer shared. And that was because we were in the middle of World War II. And Henry Zillard and Einstein wrote a letter in 1939, the same year as the fair, to FDR to warn him that there was a possibility that the Germans were building something called an atomic bomb. And that got the country on the road to beating the Nazis to this technology so that we could win the war. And from that point on, there's been a sort of a big lid on big science. Secrecy has been part of the big game plan there. And that's what I call that's when I say it collapsed, because in 1945, once people realized what scientists were actually doing for the sake of winning the war, this idea of this amazing utopia was sort of a little different now, because all of that could still come, all of that could still happen, but all of these gains could also be wiped out in a second. So that created this huge sort of crisis psychologically and socially and culturally from 45 on. And I think while a sense of wonder and while science fiction and people's fun with technology continued way past into the 50s and into the 60s, there was a certain bit that was lost. There was this sense that there was, science and technology for the rest of us, and then the stuff that we don't really know what's happening, and that was a curtain that closed.
It seems to coincide really with the birth of the national security state in 47 in some ways, I guess. The idea that that democracy closes and public spaces close and access to everything, perhaps to both government and to big science, kind of closes, I imagine.
Yeah. I mean, that was it. I always thought it was interesting that I guess historians say that the Cold War officially started in May of 47 because of the launch of the Truman Doctrine, and literally within weeks, Kenneth Arnold saw his flying saucers. I just think I think that's interesting. I think that has more to do with sort of a zeitgeist more than anything, intentional or anything like that. It's just sort of, it was bound to happen in a sense.
Yeah, I don't think you can talk about flying saucers without talking about that change in the perception of national security, both maybe perception as well as the reality. Things changed, and again, whether it was just some cosmic coincidence, it seems that the two become linked forever on, the idea of sources having something to do with government secrecy. So
absolutely. And flying saucers are linked to the atomic age, the atom bomb. And I mean, the way it's usually spoken about, the sort of common wisdom about it is, the fact that we had the nuclear jitters manifested itself, that paranoia manifested as, the sort of mass hysteria and the UFO craze, UFO sightings. But I think it goes way deeper than that, because what changed was not simply that we became fearful and paranoid. Everything changed. The whole utopian thing that I was talking about, that was part of the technological imaginal, continued in a different form in the 50s, in the sense of there was a lot of material pushing the idea of a nuclear utopia, that atomic power was not just, end of the world stuff, that it represented advances in medicine, in energy conservation and stuff like that, which is all true. But that was what was being pushed by the government at that point to sort of counter any kind of fear or pessimism, even as things like the duck and cover program were being put out. It was since 1945, the culture has just gone through this very schizophrenic kind of tension of optimism and pessimism, of looking towards the future and being terrified of the future, kind of thing. And I think that sort of tension, one of the things that happened is, I think in a weird way, it gave birth to the flying saucer, to the UFO.
Do you see foreshadowing? You mentioned, of course, Ray Palmer, who everybody who listens to this show as well as I have a keen interest in, particularly at the moment. But do you think there was a foreshadowing in the earlier days of the pulps? For example, I'll put something up on the screen now, which here it is. The back cover of a 1946 issue of Amazing Stories, which the cover was a Shaver mystery story, no surprise there. But the back cover is this artist's imagination of these obviously flying saucers before we had the term, or at least we had the term, but it wasn't being applied to extraterrestrial spacecraft, with these aliens pouring out of it and fighting other aliens. It almost seemed like the idea was already emerging out of the pages of Amazing and out of even earlier science fiction.
Oh, absolutely. I always felt that, and I'm forgetting his name now. It's a great artist. I think that was one of his pieces, Paul, and I forget the rest of his name. But anyway, he was one of the main artists for Amazing ever since the 1920s, and a lot of his covers have become sort of iconic of the pulp era. And I always thought of him as sort of one of the fathers of the flying saucer, because he used that form in a number of different illustrations. I think even going back to the 1920s. So definitely that was being seeded there. And as Chris points out in his book, the flying saucer form didn't just appear overnight, fully formed. It has existed in popular culture in one form or another for a very long time. Not even getting into classical paintings and that kind of thing, but even within pop culture. Close to the launch of the flying saucer era, that imagery was out there. Now, what's interesting is you ask if the pulps or Ray Palmer's material sort of forecast the flying saucer. And my first response was that the pulps were part of the technological imaginal, which was very optimistic and idealistic in its basic nature. But here we have Richard Shaver, and his story is horrifying and terrifying, and it's very much in the realm of being a sort of a paranoid fantasy. So in a way, even before 1945, even before the bomb, Amazing was prefiguring a kind of paranoid future, where there were forces beyond our control controlling us, or controlling our reality. In his case, the Darrow Underground. But that's interesting because it goes hand in hand with what I think happened in the wake of this sort of collapse of the technological imaginal, which was by 1950. If you think about somebody who is, say, 70 years old in 1950, that means they were born in 1880, I think. that person within their life experienced the first telephones, the first light bulbs. They saw the first automobiles. They saw the first planes. I mean, everything that we take for granted now sort of exploded into existence within essentially a single lifetime. And on the one hand, that sort of dovetails into this sort of utopian ideal. On the other, when you have somebody who say, let's say they were a farmer and they remember when everything was just fields and prairies and farmland. And now by 1950, you have massive industrial plants and pylons with power lines and telephone lines marching through, the landscape. The American landscape itself has by that time had become almost like something out of the cover of a science fiction magazine, kind of alien. It had become almost an alien landscape. And I think by 1950, there was this real sense that there were so many invisible forces out there beyond our control, right? There were the Russians, there was atomic weaponry, but even close to home, you've got the phone company, the electric company, mass media exploded in the 50s, television, this idea that, images and sound were being beamed into your home from outside, from a big, from a nationwide system. However you experienced that technology, and a lot of it was all about entertainment and also information, getting information and news. However you experienced it, I think that there was just this general sense of feeling small, humans feeling small, embedded in this sort of these intersecting sort of huge systems of commerce and technology and media. And I think that really contributed to sort of a post-war malaise. I think, we won the war, yet the world was a hairbreadth away from destruction. And there was all this other stuff going on that one really couldn't understand. And in a lot of ways, I think the flying saucer crystallized that idea of being kind of alienated. But it's a complex, the flying saucer is a complex archetype, because I think that's what it is, an archetype. It has its negative side and its positive side. At first, people thought it was the Russians. That was like probably the first thing people thought it was, or something else that our government was cooking up, in a program probably as secret as the bomb, let's say. Where was I going with this? But I lost the thread.
That's all right. I just wanted to ask you something, because it's something which fascinates me.
Mhm.
Just the term technological imaginal. I certainly was aware of the term imaginal, or the imaginal world, being used perhaps in a Jungian sense, or the way it was championed by Henry Corbin, the idea that somehow the
Right.
imaginal is different to the imaginary. It's a term that's almost coined, while we use imaginary to dismiss something and say it's not real, it's all in your imagination. Like the way we say, oh, it's all in your imagination. The imaginal, the
Right.
way Corbin used it, implied that it was somehow between the abstract and the real. It was somehow between this world and the other. It was something which was you could experience, and it was, as in that sense, as ontologically real as the table in front of you. You just used a different sense, and that was kind of this imaginal sense, or something beyond the small idea of the imagination, some other a perceptual ability that we had to engage in this. And he was primarily looking at old, I think, like Persian and Sufi type traditions, with the idea of the eighth climate, this other climate outside of ours where different things existed. But
Yeah.
I I've always kind of myself taken that when I've applied it to the UFO phenomenon to suggest that maybe this is another reality, which is somehow an intermediate reality. When you
Yeah.
talk about the technological imaginal, do you are you presenting it just as a type of, I suppose, which also works as a cultural kind of construction, which helps explain our fascination with things like UFOs and the way that we imagine them, or do you suggest that there might be some other different level of reality that these things are operating in, where we can experience them separately to just an entire imaginary, in other words, a small imagination, kind of concept? In other words, they're not just unreal, they're somehow between this realm and another realm. I just
Right.
wanted to clarify if you had a position on that or not.
I would say that the technological imaginal is a degree less than the Corbin version that you're talking about. But I think that it sort of broke into sort of, the Corbin realm with things like the flying saucer and UFOs and other anomalous things that started happening after it's sort of, I would say, its aspect as a kind of space, sort of a utopian think space where fantasies and ideas just blended into actual scientific realities, because a lot of times scientists were inspired by science fiction, and they still are, actually. Um, but once you had that real sea change after 1945 of everyone feeling like there was something that science had broken through, this had entered almost like a hubristic kind of zone. Um, it seems almost as if the cosmos, but I think in conjunction with human consciousness, birthed the flying saucer. And when, it sounds goofy to say it that way, but really that's an aspect of, Corbin's version of the imaginal. It's this sort of like liminal space between imagination, or something that's in your head, and something that's, concrete, or at least perceptible to you and others in your environment. And it's a weird thing. It's a mystery. It's not anything you could really explain, and yet it's real enough to freak people out at the very least.
Yeah, I
So,
think some of the more interesting thinkers in the past, people like John Keel and Jacques Vallée, and more recently, say Greg Bishop with his co-creation theory, which is in the late Robbie Graham's, the book he edited,
yep.
UFOs Reframing the Debate. But the idea that somehow, and this ties into, I think, what you're saying, and I don't know if you would go this far or not, but if there is an external intelligence to us, if there's something which is genuinely not just us imagining things, if there is another intelligence which is part of the UFO phenomenon, for example, or behind the UFO phenomenon,
Right.
is it possible that we are somehow engaged in a game of co-creation with it? That it's taking our expectations and perhaps molding them or reflecting them back to us, that it's showing us almost what we expect to see, or that we're doing a dance with it, and where that intelligence and us are creating this new, phenomenon.
My thinking has been totally in line with that, probably since I read Reframing the Debate. Actually, I pulled out, before coming on, I pulled out my notes, because I was trying to remember where, all of this started, where I was trying to sort of place the flying saucer, right? And it happened in spring break of 2018. And I think I had just started reading, or had just finished Reframing the Debate. And I was on spring break, and I had time to think about it. And I was inspired by that book to repersonalize what the 2017 UAP thing sort of made impersonal. And I thought, I'm missing something here. Something went away, something having to do with the flying saucer as a form. Like, why doesn't it really exist anymore. I mean, it does. I mean, it's in the culture, but as a manifestation of UFOs or UAPs, you don't really don't hear much about it at all. There's the occasional sighting of one, but it's sort of basically out of the serious discussion around these things.
You sent me a
And
wonderful montage. Did you want me to put that on screen of all these different flying saucer images since we're
sure,
talking
yeah,
about?
yeah, that would be great. So when I put together an immensely long slideshow, trying to get this idea across, this was the first frame after the title slide. And with this, I was just trying to show where we were coming from. I think the slide before this was a picture of the Tic Tac or the gimbal or something like that, and a blurry little dot within crosshairs.
Right.
And that's what people see day after day after day, compared to this richness of imagination. These are images from everywhere, from movies, there's P-Funk's Flying Saucers in there from their stage shows, covers of science fiction books, covers of pulps, supposed photographs of flying saucers, structures that follow that same basic morphology, like water towers and things like that. That even though they ostensibly have nothing to do with flying saucers, that aesthetic coincided with the flying saucer. A lot of modernist design vibed with the whole aesthetic of the flying saucer. Even starting from the 30s, actually. But so this to me is sort of a snapshot, in a sense, of the technological imaginal. That was basically just I just wanted to show the contrast between where we've been, the richness of where we've been, to this sort of like paucity of where we are now with the discussion around UAPs these days.
We had actually a question before, which I probably should throw up for you. I did mark it. It was when we were first talking about the UAP terminology, and it's from a good friend of mine, Emily Menshouse, who has a great show, What the Frick Alive, which I've guested on a number of times. And she says, do you think they changed the language, i.e. to UAPs, to make us think that they had advanced encounters too, or we take their investigations more seriously? So in other words, do you think it was an intentional, I suppose, change in that terminology by the powers that be?
I think it was very intentional. And actually, as somebody who comes out of branding, and a big part of branding is not just like visuals, logo design, it's naming. Naming is hugely important. You change the name of something when you want to change the narrative. If you have a company that is perceived as being bad or having done something bad, you change the name of the company so that people dissociate the new name from the negative stuff. In the case of UAP, I think it's actually a very canny move on the Pentagon's part to sort of reframe this entire thing as a military question and a question of national security, and taking it completely out of the realm of the 70 years that we've had of flying saucers and UFOs, and even and the high strangeness that accompanied all of that. It's sort of like wiping the slate clean and starting fresh, but only talking about this as a security threat.
It's very strange because in some ways there was that sea change in 2017 that you mentioned, I think, where all of a sudden what had been essentially, a silly season story for the press to run occasionally when they were bored, and wasn't taken seriously supposedly by government since the Condon Committee in 1969, although we know that that's not exactly the case. So in some ways it did seem like this sea change, but in some ways it also seemed to reset the debate almost back to the Donald Kehoe days, where, well, the Air Force must know stuff they're not telling us, and then there became this emphasis on disclosure. Now, of course, that's it wasn't that had ever gone away, but it seemed like all of a sudden just like in Kehoe's days, there was the idea that with enough pressure, somebody's going to, finally spill the beans. And that hadn't been so much front and center in the dialogue since, probably again, since Blue Book handed the stuff over to Condon and Condon said, there's nothing to see here,
Right. Right. Yeah, exactly. It literally is like they wipe the slate clean or turn back the clock. It's like essentially what they did. And so they've negated, again, like 70 years of experiencer data, and sort of it's control of the narrative. We were talking about co-creation, and I was looking for, I had written myself a note because I wanted to bring that up. Right, the fact that, as we've been talking about, my personal conviction is that something is interacting with human consciousness, and sort of activating the iconography that the collective unconscious, as Jung puts it, has stored, right? So you'll see something that you maybe at first you just can't comprehend what you're looking at, but then you see a craft, a spaceship. Someone else might see a sky critter, something that's alive. In fact, one of the cool things that I found out with Chris Arbach's book was that I didn't realize that Kenneth Arnold eventually went into the sort of sky critter side of things, that he actually started to think they were living things and not actually craft, which I thought was fascinating. But the idea of co-creation, what's really interesting about that, it's Greg Bishop's idea, but it's also, it's a marketing term that was, I think it was first dropped by the Harvard Business Review in 2000 or something like that. And so here's a quote from the authors of the article. They were focusing on the relationship between a business and its customers, right? So thanks largely to the internet, consumers have been increasingly engaging themselves in an active and explicit dialogue with manufacturers of products and services. So basically, through essentially social media, companies started to find out how people interacted with their products, what they thought of their products, how their products sort of became part of a person's identity. It's sort of like a brand the branding has shifted dramatically from its early days when it was just a shingle hanging outside of a shop that showed you what they sold, to something super abstract and that basically relates to your identity or identifies you as part of a tribe. That's what branding has become, and it was thought of as co-creation, that process.
That's fascinating.
And an interesting tangent to this is that whole idea of, well, here's the internet, and it's like this sort of reservoir of information, people's experiences, that a marketing team can dip into to create new branding, right? That would then be very, that would really dovetail with people's lifestyles, right? That exact process is happening now with AI, where the internet is this repository, almost like a kind of this sort of crazy untethered version of the human unconscious, and AI dips into that and takes assets from there and ideas and images from there to create a wholly new reality. And I think that's one reason that, especially when you look at some of the weirder AI artwork out there and video material, I don't know, it strikes me that some of that stuff looks eerily, has the texture of dreams. Like, I'll look at some AI video,
Mm-hmm.
and it'll feel like something is plucked it out of my head. Like, there's one of my favorites is, do you know Pookie Park?
No,
Have you seen that?
No.
Someone using AI, somebody created a mock 50s ad for an amusement park called Pookie Park.
Huh.
But the thing is that the amusement park isn't just rides; it's all sorts of puppets of different sizes that some of them, serve you the food at the concession stands. Some of them hang out and play with your kids. Some of them are 30 feet tall. Some of them are about the size of a person. But at a certain point during the day, a siren will go off, and then all the visitors have to run because the puppets run after them.
Terrifying.
And it's terrifying, but it's very funny because it really perfectly captures that sort of like, that voice and that aspect of a 1950s commercial, but it's also terrifying. And when I would see it, I thought, gosh, I feel like I've seen something like this. Not necessarily on TV when I was a kid in the 60s, but maybe in a nightmare that was triggered by something I saw on TV in the 1960s. It's really hard to describe, but I find that fascinating. That sort of,
There's an uncanniness to it, I think, which is also
yeah,
native to nightmares, right? The uncanny that something's, off, that there's a figure that's not quite the right size or without quite the right proportions, but,
yeah,
there's something just not right about it. And that's often the state in dreams as well. So maybe that, I mean, I'm just hypothesizing, but maybe that is why AI does have that dreamlike feeling.
mhm,
That and reality morphs sometimes in dreams as well. And when you
right,
watch, it might change as AI videos get better, but certainly a lot of the AI videos now have a sense of things morphing and there a lack of stability. And I
yeah,
know certainly a lot of my dreams, I'm sure most people's have this morphing kind of nature where you're in one house and then, oh, I thought I was in another. And you don't even think like that way in a dream, but your
right,
landscape changes very quickly and the people
right,
can transform. And
right,
that's very much like what we're seeing in the current generation of AI videos, I think.
right, right. No, absolutely. So anyway, as I was thinking about co-creation, that was sort of like kind of a sidebar that sort of that occurred to me. But that may very well have some kind of deep connection to what we're talking about. The sort of realm where something outside of us is still connecting with us, and that together we're creating some kind of new reality for whatever reason.
I think that's
Um,
very insightful because whether it's really artificial intelligence or not, we're obviously trying to create something which is like an artificial intelligence. So if we are doing this dance with another almost intelligence, maybe that is plugging into exactly the type of co-creation thing we're talking about, where another
right,
intelligence, which is genuinely an intelligence, genuinely exterior to us, takes our ideas and morphs them and plays with them. And maybe we're always going to get a strange distortion of things. Maybe that's why so many UFO reports are they're uncanny themselves. They're nonsensical often. They have the taste of dreams and they
yeah,
have they have a mythological structure, but also sometimes just a nonsensical structure to them.
they do. um yeah, and I think this gets at something that it's been with the it seems like it's been with the UFO phenomenon from the beginning, which is that the seer seen kind of thing, that there's this intimate connection between something outside of you that you see in the sky, um, and when you see it, oftentimes it seems to notice you and responds to your seeing it, if you know what I mean. It's like I think Betty and Barney Hill, they saw this thing when they first saw it. It looked like a star, but the longer they tried to look at it, it basically came right up to them from miles away and interacted with them. Um, so, and that aspect of sort of something that something that shouldn't be connecting with your consciousness, but is, I think that's a key part of this whole thing. It's a clue that says that yes, this is something outside of us, but it has a real big interest in interacting with our consciousness, even on an individual basis. And I like how that dovetails with phrases like, oh, what's that one, the Nietzsche one,
Stare long enough into the abyss.
yep, and it'll stare back, or something like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
I mean, his intention wasn't exactly what we're talking about, but it's a very powerful echo of what we're talking about. I find
And
that
also John
fairly
Keel, of course, and in the Mothman Prophecies movie, the Alexander Leak character, they essentially use they make it very, shorthand, but it's essentially Keel's idea when he's talking to the Richard Gere character, and Gere says, why me or something? He's like, because they notice that you notice them. And that's something quite constant in Keel's work, if
Yeah.
you shouldn't get too involved in this stuff. If you get too involved and you start getting haunted by this stuff, burn all your occult books, stop thinking about it, get rid of your UFO materials, because they know you're aware, and then they're going to come to you more. They're going to feed off you more.
Right. I mean, you hear all the time people who are ufologists or who investigate this stuff oftentimes have to just sort of step back because it all becomes too much. Yeah, I hear that kind of thing all the time. I think Bishop has told the story in appearances that I've heard him make on podcasts of, in his earlier days of investigation, it got to the point where he got really paranoid. Like he felt like somebody was rifling through his mail. Like he'd find open mail all the time, correspondences from people that he was talking to, experiences or other ufologists. And it got to the point where all he could do was sort of let go and say, because otherwise he was just going to go insane. So what he did was he basically said, I can't care about this. I don't care. And the weird thing was it stopped. As soon as he stopped caring about it, the weirdness stopped. The mail stopped getting opened, kind of thing, which I don't know quite what to make of that, but that's fascinating to me.
Yeah, it fascinates me too. The way that our attitude seems to have an impact on it. We have a question from the Dead End Collective, who's a regular audience member, and he asks, if you study history and the phenomena, it tends to morph with massive global fear. Do you agree?
Yes, I would agree. Not that I have all the data on that, but yeah, this seems to come in waves when there's big changes afoot. We had the wave of airship sightings at the very end of the 1800s, just as really we were entering what we call modernity right now, and just before scientists really discovered the inner workings of the atom. People saw airships, which I thought was interesting. And a few years later, airships were being used in warfare, and Zeppelins were bombing the crap out of London. That wasn't that much later. It was a couple of decades later. One of the things that's one would have to go start delving further back into the material that I've been amassing is actually, it's one of the cool things about this, what I call the technological imaginal, which is that it's bookended by mysterious things in the sky. It opens with a mysterious thing in the sky, and it closes with the flying saucer. And what it opens with is the hot air balloon. I don't know if you've read anything about those days when the Montgolfier brothers first sent a manned hot air balloon into the skies over Paris, but that changed everything. That we can't. There's no way we can appreciate it now. But some of the biggest crowds ever in Paris would gather to see one of these balloons launch, just because it was just an amazing sight that not only had no one ever seen, but no one could imagine up until that point. I was reading books by, I forget his name now, a historian, a cultural historian, who wrote a couple of books. One of them is called Falling Upwards, which is about that era of the early balloon days, the balloon craze as it was. And he talks about just these massive crowds watching these things go off, and also the response of, there was a response of the public, the crowds, and then there was the response of philosophers and politicians, people like Ben Franklin. There's a quote of Ben Franklin's, and I'm going to paraphrase it badly, but he talks to a friend about how interesting it is that ever since this whole balloon thing started happening, all anyone in their circles would talk about was, well, what's the next amazing thing that's going to happen? Are there going to be flying this, flying horses, flying that? So what happened was when the aerostats, which is the word I prefer to use because balloons just doesn't sound very impressive, but when that happened and people first saw them, those were really the first thoughts about the future that were about real change. Before that, thoughts about the future had to do more with changes in power structures, the second coming, things like that. But it wasn't associated with a real difference in the texture of the world as led by human invention. And when balloons happened, that it sort of opened an entire kind of part of the human imagination, which I think of as the beginning of the technological imaginal, because modern science fiction came out of that, utopianism came out of that, the whole Western idea of progress came out of that. The sense that, wow, look what happened when when scientists and inventors get together, and they build upon discoveries of the past. All of a sudden, you see a human being in the air, thousands of feet above you, which was astonishing, just like totally astonishing to people back then. So then it opened up the imagination. It was like, well, what's the next thing? What are people going to think of next? And I think that's sort of the beginning of futurism, the beginning of science fiction as we know it now.
Yeah, and we enter. I totally agree with you. And we entered a space which hadn't been ours. I mean, the heavens were a space which were relegated to either physical beings like birds, or more to the point, other spiritual beings or higher forces or gods or fairies or
Right.
things which weren't bound by the constructs of our reality. So for us to all of a sudden enter that sphere, that's like more potent than just inventing a motor car, for example, or more
Sure.
potent than inventing a steam engine. As much as those things might have been even in some ways more important, there isn't that significance which we're changing the sphere that we can exist in as human beings. We've
Right.
entered the sphere of the gods, essentially.
Absolutely. And also, as a correlation to the whole thing of the seer being seen, and that sort of like interesting connection, the aerostat or ballooning craze was not just about people responding to something astonishing that they saw in the skies, and this also lends this whole thing an air of being democratic. This is what I was talking about, which is that people felt not only were amazing things happening, but they felt like they could potentially be a part of that. If somebody could create a balloon, maybe I could create a balloon. And not just that, but here's this guy flying through the air, which is amazing to see, but what is he seeing? I want to do that. I want to get up there. I want that God's eye view. And I can do that because he did, so humans can have a God's eye view. And I think that was I think that was a big thing. That sort of that dual aspect of this of wow, look at this amazing thing, and wow, I want to be in that situation as well. I mean, it's the same thing that drives people to become, little kids dream of becoming astronauts. It's sort of the same. It's the same impulse, and that I think that's been a big part of the technological imaginal. That direct line from a sense of wonder and the imagination to acting on it in the concrete form.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
What just a fascinating conversation with you. And we had another question from the Dead End Collective, and I would encourage people to click on the show notes, as Catherine mentioned, to find out more about you as well. But he might have missed the very beginning. And he says, Marco takes a viewpoint which is very balanced. Who is he, and can Dean introduce him? Well, I did at the beginning, but as we let Marco go, maybe I'll let people know, Marco, where they can find more of your stuff. I know your site's launching soon. And again, just a little bit about who you are before you say goodbye.
I am, as Dean said earlier on, I'm a graphic designer, and I've worked in branding, which means I've done a lot of thinking about images and how people respond to images. And I guess I've taken that sort of training into this area of that's why I call it reverse engineering. It's sort of a joke, my little joke about reverse engineering. The flying saucer as an archetype. It's almost like the flying saucer was a logo, right? So all of the work that goes into a logo and making it meaningful, how do we figure out why the flying saucer is what it is, looks like it does, what are its attributes? All of that comes from my training in graphic design and branding and iconography and stuff like that. It's just a really fun way to apply that. And in terms of my presence, really, it's really just been me happening upon conversations online, which has led to my appearing on a couple of podcasts. Barbara Fisher's 60 Degrees of John Keel. I'm on a couple of episodes there. On Conspiranormal as well, which is where you appeared and I first heard about you. And I think Conspiranormal has some Patreon content, and that's where you can find these immensely long visual presentations that I did on exactly this subject matter. I'm talking like hundreds of images. These are long presentations. Which
Conspiranormal's great. Yeah, people should go and check those out and think about
I feel they're not as coherent as they could be, which is why I always welcome an opportunity like this to sort of get on and explain some more of it and spout some more of it.
Dead End Collective is asking you if you have a Facebook presence as well, or where they can get a hold of you at the moment. But you have a website coming out soon, so maybe you can say that. And because it's launching next month, I think, is that right? I'm
hoping to get it launched by Halloween, as I said. So the URL is Liminosity, almost like luminosity, but Liminosity as in liminal.
That'll be in the show notes as well for people. They can go and find that there.
Liminosity.space, SPACE. And it essentially will be a blog where, I take some of these ideas and just sort of break them down into little entries. So.
Well, it was just such a great joy chatting to you. I'm so glad that you agreed to come on. So thank you so much for joining me tonight, Marco.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on. And it's been fun to talk about this stuff with you.
We'll have you back, because I could talk about this kind of stuff with you forever. And until I do talk to you again, Marco, until I talk to everybody else out there, please keep it weird.